planning and implementing a config manager site hierarchy. All right, congratulations, number 20. It feels like we've really covered a lot together over the last 20 nuggets or so. And at this point, you really have pretty much everything you need to know to be successful with Config Manager. And the only thing that we haven't talked about yet is what happens when you need to extend your Config Manager infrastructure past just a single site and or a single server. We've talked about how you can add additional distribution points and management points and the other kinds of roles. But what happens whenever you have multiple sites or multiple geographic locations where you need to put sites and site services and make those all work across relatively latent network connections? I've kind of purposely limited the whole hierarchy conversation to this point because it's important to understand the basics of Config Manager before we start getting into all the vagaries of creating a multiple site architecture. And once you understand what you know to this point, really understanding what those three different kinds of sites are as they exist in 2012, this should be relatively easy for you. Now, what's interesting is that while a lot of if you're used to site hierarchies back in 2007, a lot of the fundamentals of hierarchy construction really haven't changed too much in 2012. The one big deal that has changed is this whole notion of a flattened hierarchy. Now, back in the old days, back in 2007, and prior to this release, it was possible for you to create a central site and then many layers deep of primary and in some cases secondary sites in order to support whatever your needs were. Well, that may have worked for some organizations, and mainly it worked for Config Manager because it kept the tree deep as opposed to wide. But in this version, Microsoft asserts that they are attempting to essentially flatten the hierarchy so you can really only go one level deep. So I'll talk to you in just a second about a CAS, a central administration site, and a primary site and a secondary site. But recognize that if you have an old multiple tiered site structure back in the '07 days, you're going to have to flatten that hierarchy down so that you have one level of CAS, one level of primary, and potentially one level of secondary sites. Now, if all of this is meaningless to you, don't sweat it, because we'll talk a little bit about how you go about constructing that hierarchy and why it needs to make sense. What you really need to know is that really the site-to-site bandwidth and latency, for most of us, tends to make most of the architectural decisions for us. There are some circumstances where you may have different lines of business that need to have their own separate config manager infrastructures, although those tend to be getting less and less these days. For the most of us, because we have multiple sites that sit out there across latent LAN connections or latent WAN connections, we want to be able to provide site services without all the clients out in those far remote sites needing to come in directly all into our central location. That's the main reason these days why you break things apart, although other ideas exist. Now in this nugget, we're going to talk about how you install a CAS as well as a primary and a secondary site. You have already installed a primary site before. Back in nugget number 3, when we installed that first config manager server, that was the single site scenario. And so creating that site isn't terribly exciting. And don't worry, I'm not going to go through the entire process of how to install because you've pretty much done this at this point. What you do need to know is how you take a secondary site and you end up connecting it to a primary site, and then a primary site that you end up connecting up to a CAS in order to create this hierarchy that we keep talking about here. And that's really what we're looking for, is some sort of just hierarchy of sites and site servers that allow all this communication to flow up and flow down. We will also spend a little bit of time talking about database replication and site senders. Site senders are not new to Config Manager, but the whole notion of database replication is. There's some improvements in how the data gets transferred up and down throughout the whole site hierarchy that we need to take a look at. So what I want to do, I don't want to dig right into the click by click just yet, because I want to spend just a minute kind of talking about this whole notion of a central administration site. And you know, in '07 we had a central site, but now the central site is, in 2012, it's kind of a special animal. And I've mentioned it back in the third nugget that right when you first install Config Manager, right out of the gate, you have one decision that you have to make. And that decision kind of breaks apart your environment into one of two options. The first option is the single idea, or the single concept. And in that environment, you only ever intend to have one server. One site server, one site, and you never ever intend to expand past that one single server. And that's actually what we did back in nugget number 3, was we created this single server and single site configuration. But the problem with that configuration is that once you make that decision, you can never expand that environment to multiple sites, ever. It's a single server, and that's pretty much it. Now, if you ever think that you need to go beyond a single server, so greater than one server or greater than one site, well, the way in which we construct these is by constructing 2 servers, one of them being a CAS and one of them being a primary site. This configuration is necessary because the CAS is a special type of site. Unlike in the old days, back in 07, when we had a central site, which was just the site that everybody pointed to, in 2012, the CAS is actually a very special type of site that, and you'll notice here, clients cannot be assigned to. So you're not going to have any clients that are out there talking directly to that CAS site server. It also only supports primary sites as its child site. So I can't have a CAS here that's connecting up to some sort of secondary server. It has to be a primary here. It also, the CAS does not directly process client data. Now, these 3 are important because the whole function of a CAS is really for reporting and also for centralization of your metadata. So when you think of the CAS, the whole notion here is that you've got this nice server that all of your sites ultimately point themselves up to, so you have one location where all the data ends up aggregating up at the top. In the same vein, you can have one location where you can send all of the package contents down to down-level sites. So it really truly is a central site in the sense that it is the collection of all that data. A CAS cares about data, and that's pretty much it. So that's why you don't want clients directly talking to it. That's why it does not directly process client data. In fact, as you see here, the CAS does not actually support all the site system roles. It only supports asset intelligence, reporting, software updates, WSUS, the system health validator, which is a role that we haven't talked about but deals with network access protection, and the endpoint protection point rules. And if you kind of dig through the lines here in these roles that it supports, you'll notice that these are the roles where generally a server needs to go talk to something else. Right? In asset intelligence synchronization, that's going to be your asset intelligence database at Microsoft. In the software update, again, that's going to be Microsoft. Endpoint protection is going to be for forefront endpoint security settings and all the anti-malware updates that need to come down. So that's really what it's for, is supporting reporting and supporting all that synchronization out to the outside world. What's interesting, and this may not necessarily be well known, is that if you do end up in a CAS architecture, the asset intelligence synchronization and the endpoint protection agent can only be installed on the CAS. So this, again, is going to be this kind of special server that's intended primarily for the aggregation of hierarchy data. And then that's really what it's there for. So, all right, I had my single server. Now I've got to think about, all right, well, if I ever want to go past 1, I kind of actually have to start with 2. I have to have, first of all, the CAS, and then I have to have at least one primary that talks to my clients. So as you can see, this decision becomes very important because automatically you're starting with 2 servers instead of just 1. Okay? Again, very important decision to be made here because of all the interrelations that have to occur between that primary and that CAS server. Now, with all of this in mind, we have to kind of think about how we want to end up constructing our config manager infrastructure. So we might have, let's just say that this is the geographic location that we think of as, oh, I don't know, let's call this the Denver location. And in this Denver location, I know that I want to have a primary server here, and I know that I need to have a CAS server also. So this primary server ends up talking to this CAS server, and the primary server then fulfills all the necessary bits associated with that Denver site. So it manages the clients, it distributes the software, it does all the usual work that you think of as a config manager server. But in addition to this Denver location over here, maybe I have another remote office that may exist over in Las Vegas. And so that Las Vegas office has to have its own stuff as well. Now is where we start to have some important decisions about what kind of site server that we need to deploy into this alternative location. I have two options, and really only two options. In option one, I can put another primary server here and have this primary server talk to my central server. In option two, I can put a secondary server and have that secondary server talk to potentially this primary server here in Denver or some other primary server. So I have to go central, primary, secondary whenever I look at those three tiers of site servers that I can create between the different environments that I have. Potentially, too, I can create another site here. I don't know, what if I have Omaha as my third location? And then again, I have to determine whether or not I want a primary server or whether or not I want a secondary server. So these are the decisions that you're going to have to make. And again, whereas network latency and bandwidth between these different sites determines whether or not you create a site or not. Right? So I could just make Las Vegas the part of the Denver site, and all the clients in there just talk directly to my Denver site servers. The determination then between a primary and a secondary site will depend mostly on how much local control do you want the administrators in that location to have over what gets deployed. You think about that, right? So maybe the people over in Las Vegas, they're pretty good. Right? And so because they have their own IT department, the IT department there we trust, they're relatively well skilled. I want to give them all the things that they need in order to support them managing their own clients. Well, in that case, I'm going to choose a primary site because that primary site has all the necessary stuff in place. So, I mean, it acts just like the primary site we've been dealing with so far, so that they can accomplish all the usual tasks of Configuration Manager. But those people over in Omaha, and if you're in Omaha, don't worry, I'm not making fun of you. But you know, the Omaha crowd is not that great. And there's only a couple of people there, and they're not really config manager people. So as a consequence, well, I'm not going to give them a primary site, but instead create a secondary site that connects up to Denver. In this case, all the clients in Omaha will talk to that secondary site server and get their information from the secondary site server, and it'll go ahead and talk up through the primary and back all the way up to the central site. So again, lots and lots of decisions that you have to make here. Number one is network latency, so geographic locations that are separated by WAN links. And number two is how much do you trust the people that are there, or how much local control do you want to have for the people that are in that location. So let's take a look now. All right, so I've got this whole notion of the config manager hierarchy. Right, so I put here a couple of just little interesting points about when you might implement these various configurations. When you are architecting your configuration manager hierarchy, you will want to implement a central administration site or a CAS when you intend to leverage multiple primary sites at any point in the future, at any point. If that's the case, you got to start out with the CAS and a primary. Or whenever you need to consolidate those hierarchy-wide settings and also the metadata. Right? I want to take everything from multiple locations and then suck it into a single location where my asset intelligence or where my asset managers can grab the inventory that they require. Now, with that in mind, you want to implement primary sites when you need to increase the number of clients Config Manager can manage beyond the single site maximum of 100,000. So a single site can manage, well, in 2012, like 100,000 clients. Huge, huge amount. And hierarchy can manage up to 300,000. So if I need to spread my clients apart, if you have more than 100,000 clients in one geographic location, I want to see this place. But if you have more than that, then you need to add additional primary sites. More specifically, if you need to add local connectivity for your config manager consoles. So you want local control. And you want the people in that site to have independent management of content and devices. Okay, so you want them to create collections. You want them to create applications. You want them to deploy stuff. That's one of the reasons why you would create this. Now, you might choose to implement a secondary site when you want to centralize all those client communications, but you don't necessarily need local control. right? Usually for bandwidth reasons, although sometimes there are political reasons or other more people reasons why this ends up being the case. Maybe you don't just, maybe there is no local IT. So you want to be able to control the configuration of that site, but from your chair in Denver without having to go to Omaha. This happens actually relatively frequently. And also, if you don't want to deploy another full SQL license, a secondary site can actually leverage SQL Server Express instead of full SQL. Now, this is actually fairly important because the config manager license costs you something, but so does the SQL license that a config manager primary site requires. Remember when we were installing that primary site, one of the first things that had to happen was an installation of SQL Server, and I think in 2008 R2 was what I installed here. And so that can be a cost. And if there are just a few people out in that remote site, you don't want to spend the money on deploying another full SQL license, well, that secondary site can actually be useful for you in that situation. And you can also, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but you can also deploy branch cache to an extremely small site. We talked a little bit about branch cache throughout this whole series, but the Windows 7 clients and the Server 2008 R2 clients in that location can actually be branch cache enabled so that the clients themselves become distribution points. So you might not even want to implement a secondary site if the number of clients that exist in that location is very, very, very small. So when that's the case, you have an option of doing either branch cache or just simply sending down a distribution point to that location as a mechanism to ensure that the bandwidth doesn't get consumed by all of those clients trying to talk to their primary site server. You know what? I got plenty of bandwidth to support the management needs, right? So the connections to the management point, all the inventory stuff, but I don't have enough to actually distribute out content to all those individual computers whenever it comes time to run an advertisement. So this distribution point concept gives you the ability to store content locally, but keep all the management data up in some other site somewhere else. Also, distribution points are handy if you want to deploy operating systems via multicast. Now, if you recall back when we were talking about that, back in the operating systems deployment nugget, I spent a little bit of time talking about, all right, so there is this notion of deploying lots of operating systems at the same time. And it leverages this network protocol that we think of as multicast. But a lot of network engineers don't really dig the idea of multicast occurring across subnet boundaries. And in fact, multicast just is simply turned off, so it cannot route throughout your network infrastructure. Well, in certain circumstances, you might want to implement a distribution point on subnets where you want to deploy operating systems via multicast, because the multicast protocol sometimes tends to be allowed within a subnet if it's not routed outside that subnet. So this can be kind of an edge case here, but if you do intend to deploy operating systems via multicast, that is one option that's available for you. Whew, okay. So admittedly, this is a very much so a design activity. And consequently, I can't tell you all of the if-then statements that you'll have to go through to determine what you need to support your needs. You will spend some time just sitting down with a piece of paper and scratching your head, trying to figure out, all right, well, when do I implement a central administration site? When do I go primary, secondary, versus distribution point? And again, that's a design decision that's going to be based off of your specific needs. Now, all of that said, I want to spend just a minute or two going through the installation process one more time on both a CAS and also a primary site connecting to a CAS, so you can see the very small number of differences that occur when you attempt to go install this software. So you'll see here that I've got the Configuration Manager setup screen here. One of the things that you don't actually see is the fact that this actually is a different machine. So we're not working on config MGR1 now. We're on a new computer called config MGR-CAS. So as you can imagine, this is going to be my central administration server. And here I have the setup screen. If I click the install button, I've already installed all the prerequisites, all the stuff's been done, so this installation should go without really having any problems, because really what I want to show you is right here that the install a configuration manager central administration site is the link that you're going to want to hit whenever you go to install that CAS for the first time. Pretty much everything else is just about the same from what you're used to seeing in this installation back from the third nugget. You go through accepting license terms, you go through and identifying the required files. I've actually already downloaded the files here to the C drive in the downloads folder. That will locate the ones that I've already downloaded. I can do the languages just like before, which languages for client languages, and then I need to give it a site code. My site code here, we'll just call this CAS for the central site, and then the site name, so Central Administration Site. Same installation folder. I'm going to install a console here. And from this point on, really, we're doing pretty much the same installation that we did back in nugget number 3. Again, the SMS provider, which is also on this server. Do I want to join the Customer Experience Improvement Program? And there you go. So I'm not going to make you watch the installation because you don't really need to see anything here. Installing a CAS looks relatively similar to installing a primary site. So just pretend with me for a minute and assume that that installation has been completed. So just pretend with me for a minute and let's assume that that installation has completed. I have another server here called config-mgr-den. Okay, and in this case, I have already the central site that's been created, and now I want to create this primary site that attaches to my CAS. With that in mind, I've got, again, all the prerequisites that are installed. I've got the config manager setup screen here, and in this case, just like before, I'm actually going to connect up this configuration manager primary site to the CAS. Okay, I'm not going to use it as a standalone primary site. When that happens, there is one thing that you have to do here as we get through all the different checkboxes just like before, and that is to instruct this primary site server to attach to the CAS. Click here on the C drive and download to go through all the downloaded stuff just like I had before. And here in a second or two, I should have the, let's see here, languages again, and here's the site code. In this case, it'll be DEN for the Denver site. Choose Next. And this is the screen that I've been looking for. Takes a couple of clicks to get here. This screen says, rather than installing this primary site as a standalone site, I'm actually going to join this to an existing hierarchy, which would be config-mgr-cas.company.pri. Okay, and that's it. Again, just like before, I'm not going to go through all the extra steps. You don't necessarily need to see it. But that's the process that you'll go through to install a primary site server. Now at this point what I'm going to do is actually pause this recording because what I want to show you is the process for installing a secondary site server, which if you recall when we actually began this setup wizard, there was no longer a selection in there for installing a secondary site. Now in 2012, installing the secondary site doesn't happen from the DVD media. Instead, it happens from within another site server. So we've got to actually accomplish that here from the installation of this config manager DEN. I also can't show you how it works on config-mgr1 because we installed that as a standalone site. So let me pause things. I'm going to allow both of these installations to complete. When we come back, I'm going to show you the process for actually creating a secondary site. And we're back. So that was about, I don't know, 30 minutes or so, long enough time to get some lunch, watch the CAS complete its installation, and then restart and watch the primary server complete its installation. Obviously the CAS has to be installed first because the primary server then needs to connect to it to initiate all the database replication that occurs between a primary and a CAS server. We're on here, this client is currently on that CAS server, so I'm actually on the server config-manager.c/cas. And I'm taking a look at both of these sites here, the first being a central site and the second being a primary site. So you've had an opportunity now to see how both central and primary sites get installed. What you haven't seen yet is the process of installing a secondary site. That process happens not from the DVD, as I talked about earlier, but instead by right-clicking on a primary site and choosing to create a secondary site. What this does is it installs or it brings up the Create Secondary Site wizard, which will install that site onto whatever server you want, and then deploy out the management point and distribution point roles to that secondary site server. Now recall that one of the reasons why we may want to actually implement a secondary site is because I don't want to spend the money for a full instance of SQL. Here in just a minute, I'm actually going to have the opportunity to install, to remotely install either full SQL or SQL Express, which is the no-cost edition. Now, just like a primary site, also I do have to provide the settings for this secondary site. It will be in Las Vegas, so we'll call it LAS for the airport code for Las Vegas. And I want to give the site server name here, which is the server that it's going to connect to, which in this case is going to be config mgr-den. So Las Vegas is the secondary, Denver's the primary, and then there's the central site. Here I'll provide Las Vegas as the site name and the installation folder for that site. I'm going to copy the source files over from the parent site server. I could also have those source files made available already on some other server that's maybe closer in network location to this server. Here's where I'll identify what server or what SQL Server instance I want to use. Up at the top is a local copy of SQL Server Express, or if there's an existing copy of SQL Server on that computer, I can use it as well. I'm going to use the SSX instance here. If IIS is not installed, I can automatically install that as part of the installation as well. And you should be fairly familiar with the other settings you see here because they're your usual settings for setting up a distribution point. Just below the screen here would be the option for using an existing certificate for this server, for this DP. Choosing next gives me an option to choose what drive space and what drives I want to use for distribution, or for sending out this distribution point. How much space is in reserve, and then also where do I want to actually send that. What do I want to use as the primary content library and package share location? Now this is kind of nice actually, because back in the day there wasn't really a good way for you to identify which drive on that server you wanted to use as your source file location or your content library location. There was a way that you could put a file with a certain name in the root of a drive to tell it to ignore that drive. But here, as you can see, I'm going to choose either an available drive or choose automatic, which will generally identify the drive with the most free space on that computer. I can identify how often I want to validate the content to make sure the content down there is the same as what it should be up on the primary server. And also I can identify what the boundary groups are for this site. Now, I kind of, early on, we spent a little bit of time talking about boundaries. In fact, there was kind of half a nugget somewhere around number 3 or 4, number 5, where we talked about, all right, a boundary is the, as it says, the boundary of authenticate or boundary of administration for what that site will control. And if that didn't make sense then, it should make sense now that you'll want to create your boundaries and also your boundary groups to support the geographicness of the different sites that you may have. So here, for example, I can add in one of the 2 boundary groups that I have. I've created one called Denver, and that Denver boundary group is associated with the Denver Active Directory site. Over here, the Las Vegas boundary group is associated with the Las Vegas Active Directory site. So this will tell my clients if I'm in that location, I want this server and this site to manage the content and also all the management data that exists in that location. I can here, I believe, also allow a failback source location for content. Now that'll be below that. If the clients can't find their content information, well then will they fail back to using some other distribution point somewhere else in the infrastructure. So this really is kind of what we're looking for creating that secondary site, and the process happens just like everything in Config Manager. It generally happens in the background. Now this installation will take about 15 minutes or so to complete. And there's really nothing that you really need to see at this point in terms of what this looks like, because here in just a minute we'll see a completed Las Vegas secondary site show up in our list of sites. So that's kind of what you need to know as it relates to sites from the CAS, the primary and the secondary site generation. Now each site also has one or more addresses that correspond to one or more site senders. Back in the day, site senders actually had more meaning in a configuration manager infrastructure. If you recall, Config Manager 2007 kind of fed off of a lot of the stuff that was originally incorporated in the SMS 2.0 and even 1.2 days. And so back then there were a lot of different kinds of networks that a that a pair of config manager servers could use for communicating. SNA networks, IBM networks, X25 networks. These days, pretty much everyone has consolidated down on using TCP/IP and Ethernet as their networking protocol of choice. So today, when we're looking at these site addresses and the senders that are used for these different site addresses, we just really think of them as IP addresses. So you see here is the address that connects the Denver site to the Las Vegas site. And here's the site that connects the Denver site to the CAS. So each one of these corresponds with a connection between one site server and another site server. Let's assume that from Denver to Las Vegas, we have a relatively slow network connection that can get easily saturated with traffic that may occur between site systems. So when that happens, or when we're aware of that, if we choose the properties for this connection, we can actually select a schedule for when communication will occur, and also any rate limits that we may want to apply for that connection as it occurs between those two sites. So this gives you the ability, even with bits already being in place, and even with all the throttling that goes on there, you can actually dial this down so that your updating only occurs at certain periods of time. Again, further ensuring that that network connection between those different sites is not going to get impacted by the data transfer between config manager servers. And that's really there's one more thing you have to be aware of. This is the first step. The second is just simply the database replication that occurs between multiple sites. So these are, as I said, the senders between sites. And then when those senders are actually communicating with each other, one of the things that they're actually accomplishing is replicating some of the contents of the database from one location to the other. In fact, if you take a look here, you'll see that for the Denver to CAS site, we actually have some database replication that's occurring. The link is currently active, and it looks like it's pretty good here because I've got active replication between these two sites. If I right-click here, I can actually save a set of diagnostic files that are associated with this database replication. So if there's something going wrong, and for some reason I just don't see content that's making its way down there, this is a good location to check to verify whether or not that replication is actually occurring or not. You'll see if I choose properties, I can even generate an alert when the link has not been working for a specified period of time, which in this case is 30 minutes. The last little piece on here that you might want to take a look at if you're ever worried about your connection is this replication link analyzer, which will take a look at from one database to another whether or not there's any issues that are going on between replicating those two databases. And as you can see here, there's no issues that have been detected. If I want, I can view these reports down here that are in log file format and also XML type format. So this is pretty much what you got to know in order to plan and implement your config manager site hierarchy. Things these days quite a bit simpler. A lot of the excess stuff that really kind of became overcome by events has been taken out of the product. We don't have to worry about all those senders and all the extra work with addresses as much as we used to. But we still have the ability to dial down all of our communication to ensure that we're not saturating the links that we have. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We talked about the three different kinds of sites in Config Manager 2012. We spent some time with installing a CAS, a primary, and also a secondary site. I spent a minute or two talking about the flattened hierarchy that we get here with Config Manager 2012 and how in the old days we could have a fairly deep hierarchy, but these days our hierarchy is generally CAS to primary server and primary server to secondary server. The architectural decisions that we make here between site-to-site communication more often than not has to do with the bandwidth and the latency that occurs between those two geographic locations. There can occasionally be political issues or business-to-business issues that may create multiple simultaneous structures, but a lot of times it's just simple bandwidth and latency that are the biggest reason why these things occur. And then we spent some time installing the CAS, the primary and the secondary site, and just taking a look very quickly at the database replication and site senders nodes on there so you're aware of what to look for if you ever end up experiencing any problems. So this has been pretty much the conclusion of this 20 nugget series on Config Manager 2012. As I said, I think at the beginning of this series, this is my 16th series with CBT Nuggets. And once again, it's an honor and a privilege to work with you over these last 20 nuggets, spending some time helping you recognize everything from installing Config Manager through getting it ready to go, and then ultimately deploying out the operating systems and the applications and the configurations and everything you need to be successful with proactively managing your IT environment in a fully automated way. As always, I hope this has been a fantastic experience for you. I wish you the best of luck on that exam, and also just the best of luck in developing all those little automations that will hopefully bring you a troubleshooting-free environment. Best of luck again. I hope this has been absolutely informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.